Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped into the studio with the kind of composed intensity that comes from both exhaustion and resolve, the mixture that appears only when someone has spent the better part of several years watching institutions bend under political pressure. The lights overhead softened as the producers adjusted angles, the quiet hum of the control room bleeding faintly through the soundproof glass, but Crockett's focus was already locked in place. Her shoulders rose and fell with a shallow breath as she settled into her chair, but her eyes held a sharp, unblinking clarity. She had agreed to this interview not because she expected it to change the minds of those who had long made peace with their version of reality, but because there were people, millions, she suspected, who were still grasping for clarity in the fog of political spectacle. And clarity, she believed, required someone willing to say out loud what others were content to imply. That duty, for better or worse, had fallen to her more often than she anticipated. The CBS correspondent, professionally neutral but inwardly bracing for a conversation that had already ignited cable news segments across the spectrum, welcomed her with a brief smile. There was no preamble. The moment the cameras went live, the soft smile hardened into journalistic discipline. Crockett was asked about the latest wave of hearings, the ones that had become less about public service and more about political choreography. She listened without interrupting, nodding only slightly, her fingers clasped together as if holding back a reservoir of thoughts. When she finally responded, it was not with the clipped caution typical of congressional interviews. Her voice held a textured blend of disbelief and simmering frustration, the controlled anger of someone forced to repeatedly watch a system designed for justice mutate into a shield for power. She said that the entire process had become untethered from principle, that the hearings were no longer aimed at uncovering truth, protecting communities, or ensuring accountability. Instead, she argued, the proceedings had warped into a partisan shield crafted around a single individual whose political presence commanded unwavering obedience from his allies. The theatrics of victimhood, she asserted, were being co-opted not to elevate actual victims of violence, discrimination, or systemic inequality, but to reposition the former president as the center of an imagined persecution narrative. It was a distortion that, in her view, had grown so large that it swallowed the legitimate grievances of individuals who had suffered real harm. In her words, they're not protecting victims, they're protecting him, and the him did not need to be named for viewers to understand. The interviewer pressed gently, asking whether she believed this dynamic was intentional or simply the byproduct of a fractured political climate in which every institution was dragged into the gravitational pull of partisan identity. Crockett did not hesitate. She said it was intentional, unequivocally so, because when institutions bend repeatedly in the same direction, at some point the pattern becomes undeniable. She described committee rooms where evidence was ignored, where testimony was cherry-picked or weaponized, where witnesses were treated not as participants in a democratic process but as stage props for political messaging. She had seen moments in which survivors of actual harm were sidelined or silenced because their stories failed to fit the desired narrative arc. And all the while, the machinery of the hearings kept redirecting towards the former president, painting him as the aggrieved party, the misunderstood figure whose legal and political troubles were framed not as consequences of his actions but as attacks from shadowy enemies. Her tone deepened as she spoke, not louder but heavier, carrying the weight of someone who had sat through too many meetings where the outcome had been predetermined. She explained how the rhetoric around protecting victims had subtly shifted. Instead of focusing on people who endured violence, discrimination, or abuse, some lawmakers had begun using the language of victimhood as a shield to defend the actions of the former president, transforming him into a symbol of collective grievance. This linguistic sleight of hand, Crockett argued, was dangerous. It encouraged millions to identify with a narrative that distorted the purpose of justice, replacing facts with feelings, law with loyalty, and civic responsibility with political tribalism. The conversation wasn't about policies or legislation anymore, it was about manufacturing a mythology in which accountability itself became suspicious. She leaned forward slightly, the gravity of her frustration visible in the way she tightened her jaw before speaking again. She described, in detail, how committee members who once championed the rights of victims had begun using the language of empathy in a selectively performative way. When the issue involved ordinary people harmed by gun violence, or families devastated by police brutality, or women seeking justice after being assaulted, the same lawmakers who now preached about protecting victims suddenly found procedural excuses to avoid engagement. Hearings would stall. Bills would die quietly in subcommittees. Statements of outrage were replaced with deflections about jurisdiction or timing or constitutional theory. Yet when a legal challenge targeted the former president, those same lawmakers erupted with theatrical outrage, treating him as the embodiment of every citizen they claimed to defend. Crockett said this inversion was not just intellectually dishonest, it was corrosive. She recalled moments that had stuck with her, scenes inside the congressional hearing rooms that felt surreal even in real time. There were afternoons when she listened to colleagues describe the former president as a victim of unprecedented political attacks, all while dismissing the real and measurable harm experienced by thousands of their own constituents. She remembered the uncomfortable silence that followed when she challenged the inconsistency. She remembered the way her words were met with rehearsed indignation or patronizing dismissals. These were not normal disagreements between lawmakers, they felt like debates between two incompatible understandings of reality. In one, victims were individuals who had suffered harm due to violence, injustice, or systemic neglect. In the other, the word victim had become a political accessory, used only when convenient and only when it advanced a narrative designed to protect one man. The interviewer asked whether she felt isolated in these moments, whether speaking out came at a political cost. Crockett paused, a reflective silence filling the space between them. She admitted that it would be easier to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to allow the theatrics to continue unchallenged. But she felt indebted to the community she represented, people who did not have the luxury of indifference. Her constituents lived with the consequences of policy decisions that were too often shaped by political performance rather than real need. They were survivors of domestic violence navigating underfunded support systems, families who lost loved ones to preventable shootings, communities wrestling with inequity woven into the fabric of daily life. For them, the distinction between genuine victims and political narratives was not academic, it was visceral. She said that when lawmakers misuse the language of protection, they trivialize the real struggles of people who depend on the government to uphold justice. They make it harder for survivors to be heard, harder for reforms to gain traction, and harder for the public to understand the stakes. They turn governance into a courtroom play, one in which evidence becomes optional and empathy becomes conditional. The more she spoke, the more apparent it became that her frustration was not directed merely at those who defended the former president. It was also directed at a political environment that rewarded spectacle over service. She said that the country could survive disagreements over policy, it could even survive contentious elections. But it could not survive leaders who abandoned the basic moral responsibility of governance, to protect people who lacked the power to protect themselves. When the interviewer asked whether she thought anything could break this cycle, Crockett's expression shifted into something more contemplative. She acknowledged that institutions were not inherently doomed, they were shaped by the decisions of the people within them. But she believed that a change in behavior required a change in incentives. As long as lawmakers faced no consequences, electoral, political, or reputational, for prioritizing the protection of a powerful figure over the needs of ordinary citizens, the dynamic would continue. She pointed to the way misinformation spread rapidly, reinforcing the narrative that accountability was persecution and that any investigation involving the former president was inherently illegitimate. This, she argued, created a feedback loop. Lawmakers amplified victimhood narratives because their constituents believed them, and constituents believed them because lawmakers amplified them. The truth had less gravity than the spectacle. And she paused there. Crockett took a slow breath as she continued, her voice steady even as the emotions behind her words grew more layered. She said that what frustrated her most was not simply the political loyalty surrounding one man, but the way loyalty had morphed into an obligation to rewrite the meaning of truth itself. In hearings, debates, and televised speeches, she watched colleagues insist, sometimes angrily, that facts contradicted by evidence were true if they aligned with the political narrative. This type of distortion, she explained, didn't remain confined to the halls of Congress. It seeped outward into communities, shaping how millions understood justice, accountability, and even the role of government. When elected officials defended the former president not with legal arguments but with emotional appeals that cast him as a martyr, they encouraged citizens to embrace a worldview in which laws were flexible and consequences optional. She went on to describe how this narrative forced lawmakers like herself into a difficult position. When she attempted to steer discussions back to actual victims, people whose lives had been derailed by violence, exploitation, or systemic neglect, she found herself painted as combative or divisive. The irony was never lost on her. Speaking on behalf of real victims was considered controversial, while centering hearings around the grievances of a powerful former president was treated as normal. She said she often felt trapped inside a parallel political universe, one where the language of justice had been rearranged to the point of inversion. In that universe, the more resources someone had, the more deserving of protection they were portrayed to be. Meanwhile, those with the least power, those who desperately needed a functioning system, were pushed further toward the margins. The interviewer asked whether she thought the public recognized this inversion or whether the spectacle had consumed too much of the national conversation for people to see the underlying shift. Crockett said she believed people were aware, but exhausted. The intensity of political drama over the past several years had left many Americans emotionally drained, overwhelmed by the constant churn of accusations, scandals, and televised conflict. In that state of fatigue, it became easier to accept the loudest voices rather than examine the details. She feared that this was precisely what certain lawmakers relied on, the hope that the public would be too worn down to differentiate between real and manufactured narratives of victimhood. But exhaustion, she warned, could not be a sustainable foundation for democracy. She shifted slightly in her chair as she recounted how her own experiences shaped her reactions during these hearings. Long before she entered Congress, she had worked with clients whose lives had been irreversibly changed by violence or injustice. She knew the faces of families who waited months or years for their cases to be taken seriously. She had sat in cramped office spaces, listening to people recount traumatic events that reshaped their futures. So when she heard colleagues claim, in bold and booming voices, that the former president was the most persecuted political figure in American history, she felt a visceral discomfort. Her background made her sensitive to the difference between actual victimhood and its political performance. And when performance took precedence, victims lost more than just visibility, they lost opportunities for reform. The interviewer leaned in, sensing the emotional undercurrent. She asked what Crockett believed was being lost in the broader national conversation. Crockett responded that what was being lost was a shared moral compass. She explained that people did not have to agree on every policy detail or every ideological principle. Disagreement, she reminded, was inherent to democracy. But there had always been a tacit understanding that systems of accountability mattered, that the rules applied to everyone, and that justice had to be grounded in honesty. When lawmakers protected the former president by framing him as a victim of an unjust system, they weakened this shared understanding. They planted seeds of distrust that would continue to grow long after individual political battles faded. She described how this shift had real consequences for victims seeking justice. In hearings where lawmakers should have been examining issues like domestic violence, police accountability, hate crimes, or systemic inequities, the conversations often veered into political detours designed to recast the former president as a wronged figure. She said it was disheartening to watch survivors who had bravely come forward find themselves competing with the gravitational pull of a political narrative that overshadowed their lived experiences. Sometimes, those survivors watched their issues get buried in procedural arguments or overshadowed by partisan debates irrelevant to their circumstances. Crockett emphasized that these moments were not theoretical, they had faces, names, and stories attached to them. Her voice softened as she recounted one particularly striking experience. She described a woman who had traveled across the country to testify about a traumatic incident involving violence and systemic failure. The woman had rehearsed her statement for weeks, determined to make her voice heard. But on the day of her testimony, the hearing became dominated by arguments about investigations into the former president. The woman's statement, though eventually delivered, received a fraction of the attention it deserved. Crockett remembered the woman's eyes, tired, disappointed, and quietly resigned. That moment, she said, crystallized the consequences of a political culture that prioritized defending power over elevating the powerless. She continued, explaining that when victims saw their stories sidelined, many internalized the message that their suffering did not matter unless it could be weaponized politically. Over time, this eroded trust not only in lawmakers, but in the idea of justice itself. Crockett worried that this erosion made communities less likely to report violence, less inclined to seek help, and more susceptible to feelings of hopelessness. When systems routinely failed those who needed them most, people learned to expect failure. And when lawmakers rewarded that failure with political theatrics instead of reform, it reinforced a cycle of neglect. The interviewer listened carefully, then asked whether Crockett believed the trend could be reversed. Crockett nodded, though the movement of her head carried a tempered caution. She said that no political culture was unchangeable, but recovery required intentional effort. It required leaders willing to prioritize the truth even when it was politically inconvenient. It required lawmakers to acknowledge the difference between protecting individuals from legitimate injustices and protecting them from the consequences of their own actions. Most importantly, she said, it required a renewed commitment to centering victims who lacked power, rather than those who possessed it in abundance. She admitted that such a shift would be difficult in the current environment. The political incentives favored sensationalism, sound bites that traveled quickly, narratives that evoked strong emotions, and performances that captured the attention of an audience conditioned to crave conflict. But she argued that difficult did not mean impossible. She believed that people were growing tired of political theater masquerading as governance. She sensed that the country was approaching a point where citizens desired substance again, where they wanted lawmakers to return to the fundamentals of public service instead of perpetually reenacting partisan battles. She returned to the central theme of the interview, the claim that lawmakers were protecting the former president rather than victims, and clarified that her accusation wasn't hyperbole. It was an observation drawn from years of witnessing patterns. When committee sessions were transformed into platforms to defend one individual from accountability, the cost was measured in missed opportunities to address the real crises facing the nation. Gun violence continued to devastate communities. Racial inequities persisted across nearly every institution. Women continued to face barriers to justice in cases of assault. And families struggled under the weight of medical debt, housing instability, and economic inequality. These issues demanded attention, but political oxygen was often consumed by efforts to portray the former president as a persecuted figure. She looked directly at the interviewer as she delivered her next point. She said that the decision to protect the former president was not simply about loyalty. It was a strategy, one crafted with precision. By elevating him as a victim, some lawmakers created a rallying point for their base, a way to frame any criticism or legal scrutiny as an attack on all who supported him. This tactic bonded supporters emotionally to his fate, transforming political accountability into a communal threat. Crockett emphasized that this was a powerful strategy, one that exploited fear and resentment. But it was also a dangerous one, because it replaced civic responsibility with vicarious grievance. She explained that this dynamic had altered the internal culture of Congress itself. In meetings where lawmakers once focused on negotiating the details of legislation, she increasingly witnessed conversations dominated by speculation about how decisions might affect public perceptions of the former president. She saw colleagues hesitate to support even modest reforms because they feared backlash from a political base conditioned to interpret any bipartisan cooperation as betrayal. Crockett said that the gravitational pull of one man's political identity had influenced the behavior of lawmakers in ways that fundamentally undermined the purpose of Congress. Still, she refused to let frustration turn into resignation. She believed that exposing these patterns was the first step toward changing them. And she remained committed to advocating for victims whose voices were drowned out by political spectacle. She spoke about the need for leaders who were willing to call out injustice regardless of the political cost. She said that democracy did not survive on autopilot, it required people willing to defend truth even when truth was inconvenient. She closed this portion of the interview by returning to a simple but powerful idea, that the measure of a society was not how it treated its most powerful members, but how it protected those who lacked power. And right now, she said, that measure revealed a troubling imbalance. Far too much energy was being spent defending individuals who were more than capable of defending themselves, while far too little was being devoted to those suffering quietly in the shadows of political conflict. Crockett settled deeper into her chair, not out of comfort but because she sensed that the conversation was approaching territory where political realities and human consequences collided most sharply. She spoke about how disturbing it was to witness colleagues equate legal accountability with political persecution, as though the justice system existed solely as a tool to advance or obstruct partisan goals. She emphasized that when lawmakers framed investigations into the former president as attacks rather than lawful processes, they sent a dangerous message to the public, that justice should bend according to political allegiance. This notion, she warned, was fundamentally incompatible with any functioning democracy. A society where accountability depended on political identity was not governed by law but by faction. She described instances where committee members rejected factual testimony or expert analysis simply because it contradicted their narrative. Witnesses who had devoted years to studying violence, extremism, or systemic failures were dismissed with a wave of the hand, while unverified claims were elevated as truth if they served the rhetoric of protecting the former president. Crockett said it felt surreal to sit in a room where evidence was presented only to be ignored, where truth seemed to evaporate the moment it conflicted with political performance. These moments often left her wondering how institutions meant to safeguard democracy had become so vulnerable to distortion. As she spoke, her words carried a mixture of conviction and fatigue. She explained that the erosion of truth did not occur in dramatic bursts but in slow, subtle shifts. It happened when lawmakers laughed off inconsistencies rather than confronting them, when they allowed sensational claims to overshadow uncomfortable facts, when they prioritized party over people. Each small concession contributed to a larger unraveling. She said she feared that if the country didn't confront this unraveling soon, reclaiming the integrity of public institutions might become increasingly difficult. The interviewer asked whether she believed the public understood the extent to which political narratives influenced congressional behavior. Crockett said she believed some did, but many did not. Most people, she explained, were occupied with the challenges of daily life, jobs, families, bills, health struggles. They didn't have the time to dissect political theatrics or decode manipulative messaging. And those who relied on certain media outlets often received a version of events curated to confirm pre-existing beliefs. As a result, misinformation was not just commonplace, it was often indistinguishable from fact. Crockett noted that this environment gave lawmakers an advantage when crafting narratives designed to shield the former president from scrutiny. They didn't need to prove their claims, they only needed to say them loudly and repeatedly. She highlighted how harmful this dynamic was to victims whose experiences did not fit neatly into the political storylines dominating congressional discourse. When misinformation shaped public understanding, lawmakers who advocated for genuine victims were often forced to spend more time correcting falsehoods than working toward solutions. Crockett said that this distortion of priorities wasn't merely frustrating, it was debilitating. It prevented Congress from functioning effectively. It derailed legislative efforts. And most importantly, it deepened the sense of disillusionment felt by communities that had long been underrepresented or ignored. She recalled moments when she sat through hearings where the primary objective seemed to be inflaming political outrage rather than addressing issues that affected millions of Americans. Instead of discussing reforms to support victims of domestic violence, colleagues would pivot to claims about supposed conspiracies against the former president. Instead of debating ways to reduce violent crime, discussions devolved into accusations about political witch hunts. Crockett said that these detours were not accidental, they were strategic. They were designed to reframe the narrative so that any attempt to hold the former president accountable appeared illegitimate. Her eyes narrowed as she described the psychological toll this took on victims who watched these hearings from afar. Many felt their suffering wasn't dramatic enough to compete with the political circus. Some questioned whether lawmakers would ever prioritize their needs. Others grew cynical, believing the system was too broken to help them at all. Crockett said that hearing from constituents who felt abandoned was one of the hardest parts of her job. She received messages from people who had endured unimaginable trauma yet felt invisible in the national conversation. Their pain was real, but their stories lacked the political utility needed to capture sustained attention. The interviewer asked how Crockett personally navigated the emotional weight of these experiences. She replied that she had learned to compartmentalize out of necessity. She allowed herself to feel anger at the injustice, but she refused to let that anger overshadow her commitment to fighting for change. She spoke candidly about the moments when she questioned whether her voice could make a difference in an environment where truth often seemed subordinate to loyalty. But every time she felt discouraged, she reminded herself that silence only benefited those who sought to distort accountability. Speaking out, even when difficult, was a form of resistance. She explained that each time she confronted the narrative that lawmakers were protecting the former president rather than victims, she did so not because she enjoyed conflict but because the stakes were too high to remain passive. She believed that refusing to challenge these distortions created space for them to grow. And if they grew unchecked, they would eventually reshape public expectations of leadership, weaken institutional safeguards, and normalize corruption. Crockett said that protecting democracy required more than defending institutions, it required defending the moral foundations on which those institutions were built. As the conversation continued, she reflected on how political loyalty had become a substitute for integrity in some parts of Congress. She described instances where colleagues privately acknowledged that the former president's actions were problematic, even dangerous, yet publicly defended him out of fear of retaliation from his supporters. This duality, public loyalty paired with private concern, revealed the extent to which political incentives had warped legislative behavior. Crockett said it was troubling to witness lawmakers abandon their own convictions for the sake of political survival. She argued that when fear dictated decision-making, democracy became vulnerable to manipulation. She expanded on this idea, explaining that fear-driven loyalty encouraged lawmakers to adopt extreme positions they might not have supported under normal circumstances. It pushed them to escalate rhetoric, ignore evidence, and reject compromise. It incentivized them to perform outrage rather than pursue solutions. And in the process, victims became collateral damage in a political struggle that had little to do with their needs. Crockett said she could not accept that outcome. She was determined to keep pushing back, even when the resistance felt overwhelming. She emphasized that her critique was not solely about the former president but about a cultural shift that had taken root within Congress. Lawmakers had begun treating accountability as partisan, facts as negotiable, and justice as optional. This shift created an environment where the former president was shielded not because of merit but because of political necessity. Crockett warned that allowing this trend to continue would erode public trust to a point where restoring it might be impossible. Once citizens stopped believing that their government cared about them, she said, the consequences would be far-reaching. The interviewer asked whether she believed the country was at a breaking point. Crockett paused, considering the question carefully. She said she believed the country was at a crossroads rather than a breaking point. But the direction it chose depended on whether leaders were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. She noted that systems were not self-sustaining, they required active participation, accountability, and transparency. Without these elements, the system would deteriorate gradually, and by the time people noticed the collapse, it might be too late to reverse. She returned to the topic of victims, stressing that her frustration stemmed from the fact that those most in need of protection were often the least likely to receive it. She recounted stories of survivors who had reached out to her office seeking support after being ignored by other representatives. Some had been told their cases were not a priority. Others had been bounced from agency to agency, unable to navigate a system that seemed designed to exhaust them. Crockett said these individuals deserved better. They deserved lawmakers who would listen without precondition, who would advocate without hesitation, who would treat their suffering as worthy of urgent attention. She explained that when lawmakers redirected their energy toward defending the former president, they diverted resources, time, political capital, legislative bandwidth, that could have been used to address these urgent issues. She believed this diversion represented a profound betrayal of public trust. The role of Congress, she said, was to serve the people, not to stage-manage the reputation of a single individual. Yet day after day, she watched the institution contort itself to protect someone who wielded immense influence but offered little accountability in return. Her voice took on a quiet intensity as she spoke of the cumulative impact of these choices. She said that every time Congress prioritized political theater over substantive action, it signaled to victims that their struggles were secondary. It perpetuated a hierarchy of importance in which power dictated value. And that hierarchy, she argued, was antithetical to the principles of justice. She leaned back slightly, her expression contemplative but resolute. She said that despite the challenges, she believed there was still hope for change. Hope came from people who demanded better, from communities that continued to fight for justice even when institutions failed them, from activists who refused to be silenced, from lawmakers who stood firm in their convictions. She believed that as long as these voices persisted, there was a path forward, uncertain, difficult, but possible. Crockett exhaled slowly, as though releasing the residue of countless battles fought in rooms where truth was treated as an inconvenience. She said that hope wasn't something she clung to blindly, it was something she worked to cultivate, intentionally and persistently, even when the political climate made it feel like a fragile thing. She believed that hope didn't survive on optimism alone, it required action. And for her, that action took the form of speaking plainly about what she witnessed, even when doing so invited hostility. She explained that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to push through it because something greater was at stake. And what was at stake, in her view, was the integrity of governance. As the interviewer listened, it became clear that Crockett's commitment to truth wasn't rooted in idealism disconnected from reality. It was born from witnessing the real consequences of political manipulation. She spoke about parents who had lost their children to gun violence and struggled to understand why lawmakers refused to pass even the most basic reforms. She recalled conversations with survivors of domestic violence who felt trapped by systems that seemed indifferent to their suffering. She recounted stories of families torn apart by inadequate health care, by inequitable education systems, by institutional failures that rarely made headline news because they did not serve anyone's political ambitions. These were the people Crockett felt accountable to, and she believed that if she failed to speak for them, no one else would. She shifted to the broader cultural impact of the victimhood narrative surrounding the former president. She explained that portraying a powerful man as a perpetual victim created a dangerous distortion in the public imagination. It encouraged people to identify with someone whose circumstances were vastly different from their own, redirecting their anger away from systemic failures and toward imagined enemies. This misdirection, she said, made it harder for communities to demand meaningful change. When people believed that the main threat facing the country was a conspiracy against a single political figure, they overlooked the issues directly affecting their lives, issues like economic inequality, underfunded services, and inadequate protections for vulnerable populations. The interviewer asked her to elaborate on how this misdirection affected the legislative process. Crockett explained that it created a constant atmosphere of crisis, one defined not by reality but by political messaging. Instead of focusing on bipartisan negotiations or evidence-based policymaking, Congress became preoccupied with managing reactions to the latest narrative twist. Lawmakers spent hours debating events that had little relevance to the lives of ordinary Americans. Committee members repeated talking points crafted not to inform but to inflame. Hearings devolved into performative clashes designed to generate viral moments. And through it all, actual governance suffered. She noted that the escalation of rhetoric had tangible consequences. When lawmakers characterized investigations into the former president as existential threats to democracy, they raised the stakes to a level that made compromise nearly impossible. Any attempt to hold him accountable, no matter how grounded in law or precedent, was reframed as an attack on all who supported him. This made it difficult for colleagues to break ranks, even when they privately disagreed. Crockett said that fear was a powerful political tool, fear of backlash, fear of losing support, fear of becoming a target of the same outrage machine they had helped sustain. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she described the silent pressure that permeated Congress. She said that lawmakers rarely admitted it publicly, but many lived in constant anticipation of being called out by the former president or his allies. One critical comment, one vote that deviated from the party line, one acknowledgement of fact over narrative, any of these could trigger a wave of hostility from supporters conditioned to view dissent as betrayal. Crockett explained that this pressure created a culture of self-censorship among some members, making substantive dialogue increasingly rare. Even in private conversations, she sometimes sensed that colleagues were careful about how they phrased their thoughts, as if worried that their words might someday be repeated or misinterpreted. She continued by emphasizing that this culture of fear didn't only affect lawmakers, it affected staff, analysts, and even witnesses. Some experts hesitated to testify out of concern that their reputations would be smeared for offering inconvenient insights. Others worried that their work would be mischaracterized or dismissed. Crockett said this erosion of intellectual and professional integrity was among the most troubling developments she had witnessed. When people were discouraged from telling the truth because it contradicted political narratives, institutions became hollow. They lost their ability to function as sources of reliable information. The interviewer asked whether she encountered resistance when challenging her colleagues during hearings. Crockett smiled wryly, acknowledging that resistance was almost guaranteed. She described hearings where her attempts to steer the conversation back to real issues were met with interruptions, deflections, or accusations of being confrontational. Some colleagues treated her insistence on accuracy as a provocation. Others attempted to undermine her credibility by questioning her motives rather than engaging with her arguments. Crockett said she had learned to recognize these tactics for what they were, attempts to avoid substance by shifting the focus to tone. She explained that tone policing was a familiar strategy, one often used against women and people of color in positions of authority. When their words challenged entrenched power structures, critics frequently shifted attention to the manner in which those words were delivered rather than addressing their content. Crockett said this tactic tried to make emotional labor a prerequisite for being heard, a standard rarely applied to her male colleagues. But she refused to allow this dynamic to silence her. She believed that passion did not undermine credibility, in many cases, it enhanced it, because it reflected the urgency of the issues at hand. She recounted an incident where, in the midst of a heated hearing, a colleague accused her of being too emotional. She responded calmly but firmly, pointing out that if he had witnessed the suffering she encountered in her district, he would understand that emotion was not a weakness but a natural response. She added that the real issue wasn't her tone but his discomfort with the truths she was highlighting. After the hearing, constituents reached out to her, thanking her for refusing to back down. Moments like that reminded her why she remained committed to speaking plainly, even when it was uncomfortable. The interviewer asked about the personal toll of engaging in these charged exchanges. Crockett acknowledged that it could be emotionally draining, but she also said that the work came with a sense of responsibility that outweighed the strain. She understood that her presence in these spaces mattered to people who rarely saw themselves represented in positions of power. She felt a duty not only to her district but to the broader communities who looked to her as proof that their voices could reach the halls of Congress. She said that every time she challenged a narrative designed to protect the former president at the expense of victims, she did so with the understanding that silence would only deepen the harm. She spoke about the small moments that kept her grounded, a handwritten note from a young woman who felt empowered by seeing her speak out, a conversation with a constituent who finally felt heard, a message from someone who had survived violence and found strength in her words. These moments reminded her that political resistance was not measured only in legislative victories. It was measured in connection, in solidarity, in the awareness that someone in power was willing to fight for those whose stories were too easily dismissed. The interviewer then posed a question about the future, what Crockett envisioned in a political climate where truth was contested and accountability was optional. Crockett did not sugarcoat her response. She acknowledged that the road ahead would be difficult, that misinformation would continue to spread, that political incentives would remain misaligned, and that the allure of protecting power over people would not disappear overnight. But she also believed that the country had endured turmoil before and emerged stronger. She expressed faith in the resilience of communities, in the determination of young voters, in the power of collective action. She believed that change would come not from a single leader or moment but from sustained, organized effort. She concluded this segment of the conversation by asserting that the fight to protect victims, and to restore integrity to governance, was not optional. It was essential. If lawmakers continued to shape narratives around the needs of the powerful rather than the vulnerable, the country risked losing its moral foundation. Crockett said she would continue to speak out not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And she hoped others would join her in demanding a government that prioritized truth, justice, and the people it was meant to serve. Crockett took a moment before returning to the conversation, letting the previous thought settle in the air like dust illuminated by studio lights. The interviewer noticed the brief pause, recognizing it not as hesitation but as a deliberate recalibration, an effort to articulate the next point with precision. She said that one of the most corrosive elements of the current political climate was the way it demanded constant vigilance. Every statement, every vote, every expression of dissent was scrutinized not solely for its substance but for its potential impact on the never-ending narrative orbiting the former president. Lawmakers who wanted to direct attention toward victims often found themselves derailed before they could finish a sentence. The gravitational pull of that narrative was so strong that even issues with broad bipartisan support became entangled in questions of loyalty. She recalled a hearing where a bipartisan proposal designed to improve mental health resources for survivors of violent crime was overshadowed by a last-minute dispute about comments made regarding the former president's legal entanglements. Instead of focusing on how best to support traumatized individuals, the conversation devolved into accusations about political motives. Crockett described the moment as emblematic of how deeply the institution had been reshaped. The hearing, which should have been a straightforward discussion about providing relief and resources, was transformed into yet another opportunity to defend or condemn the former president. The survivors and advocates present that day watched silently as the room's attention drifted further from their lived experiences and closer to manufactured outrage. She explained that these moments were not isolated. They were part of a pattern that forced victims into the background of national discussions, even when they were physically present in the room. Crockett emphasized that victims didn't simply need symbolic recognition, they needed legislation, funding, systemic reform, and long-term attention. But the political environment made sustained attention almost impossible. Distractions were constant. Outrage was profitable. And the machinery of political communication rewarded those who could generate headlines, not those who quietly worked to address systemic failures. The interviewer asked whether Crockett believed the sensational nature of modern political discourse was intentional or simply a byproduct of evolving media landscapes. She responded that it was both. She acknowledged that the rise of social media, the fragmentation of news sources, and the speed at which information traveled all contributed to the spectacle. But she also pointed out that lawmakers had learned how to exploit these trends. They understood that the quickest path to public attention was through controversy rather than consensus. And they knew that defending the former president, especially through dramatic declarations of his supposed victimhood, was a reliable way to energize certain segments of the population. Crockett argued that this dynamic had created perverse incentives. Instead of working to solve problems affecting millions, some politicians viewed governance as an extension of their media presence. Hearings became stages, statements became performances, and facts became malleable props in an ongoing political drama. She lamented the loss of deliberative seriousness that once characterized the legislative process, even if imperfectly. Now, she said, the loudest voices often drowned out the most urgent concerns. Victims, real victims, were left navigating systems that failed them while Congress engaged in endless cycles of partisan theater. She leaned forward as she spoke, her voice carrying a sharper edge. She said that the most damaging consequence of this environment was the erosion of public trust. People who had endured trauma relied on the government to uphold fairness, protect their rights, and provide avenues for justice. But when they saw lawmakers defending the powerful instead of uplifting the vulnerable, they understandably questioned the system's integrity. Crockett mentioned conversations with victims who admitted they hesitated to report incidents because they believed they would not be taken seriously. Others expressed a sense of futility, convinced that their suffering would be overshadowed by whatever political drama dominated the news cycle that week. This distrust, she said, was a direct result of misplaced priorities in Congress. The interviewer asked whether she ever worried about becoming desensitized. Crockett shook her head. She said that she intentionally guarded against that possibility. She surrounded herself with reminders of why she entered public service, letters from constituents, photos from advocacy events, notes from survivors who had inspired her. She kept these reminders visible because she refused to allow the noise of political spectacle to numb her to the human stakes. She explained that one of the most dangerous aspects of the current climate was how easy it was for lawmakers to become absorbed in the theatrics. If they weren't careful, they could lose sight of the people affected by their choices. She told a story about a young man whose life had been altered by gun violence. He had survived, but he lost mobility in one leg and lived with chronic pain. He met with lawmakers repeatedly, urging them to pass reforms that might prevent others from experiencing the same fate. Crockett recalled how he spoke with calm determination, not anger, even though he had every right to be furious. Yet during one crucial hearing related to gun violence, she watched as colleagues sidestepped the topic entirely, focusing instead on defending the former president against perceived injustices. She remembered glancing at the young man as he listened, his eyes reflecting a mixture of disappointment and clarity. He realized in that moment that the institution he had hoped would respond to his suffering was more interested in protecting its political figurehead. Crockett said she never forgot the expression on his face. She explained that for every story like his, there were countless others, stories that never reached the public, stories buried under the cascading noise of political conflict. These individuals weren't asking for special treatment. They weren't demanding the kind of protection that lawmakers eagerly extended to the former president. They simply wanted acknowledgement, reform, and a system capable of delivering justice. But their needs were constantly overshadowed by narratives that served political interests rather than the public good. The interviewer asked whether she saw any signs of resistance within Congress, lawmakers who, even quietly, shared her concerns. Crockett nodded. She said that there were colleagues across the political spectrum who recognized the distortion and wanted to recalibrate the institution's priorities. But many of them hesitated to speak openly, fearing political backlash or alienation. She noted that silence didn't necessarily mean complacency, sometimes it reflected a calculation of political survival. Still, she believed that more voices needed to emerge publicly. Democracy couldn't thrive if truth was whispered only in private. She described the importance of coalition building, seeking out lawmakers willing to focus on genuine issues rather than performative distractions. She said that even in a divided Congress, there were moments of quiet collaboration that rarely made headlines. These moments sustained her. They reminded her that not all hope was lost, that there were still people committed to governing rather than performing. But she also admitted that these collaborations were fragile, often derailed by the latest controversy surrounding the former president. The political ecosystem was unpredictable, and even well-intentioned efforts could be overshadowed by a single inflammatory remark from him or his allies. Crockett spoke candidly about the emotional toll of watching the country become increasingly polarized around the figure of one man. She said that the level of devotion some lawmakers demonstrated toward him bordered on the religious, with loyalty taking precedence over evidence, ethics, and even personal conviction. She expressed concern that this type of allegiance fundamentally undermined democratic structures. When leaders prioritized devotion over duty, the system became vulnerable to manipulation. And when citizens adopted the same mindset, the ability to engage in critical thinking diminished. She pointed out that the elevation of the former president to victimhood status created a potent emotional narrative. People who felt neglected or unheard in their own lives found comfort in identifying with someone who claimed to be persecuted by powerful forces. Crockett understood this psychology. She recognized the human impulse to find belonging in narratives of shared suffering. But she emphasized that this identification was built on a false premise, one that ultimately harmed the people who embraced it. By redirecting their frustration toward imaginary enemies, they overlooked the institutions that genuinely failed them, institutions that needed reform, not reinforcement of a false martyrdom. She sighed softly as she reflected on the scope of the challenge. Political narratives, once established, were difficult to undo. They became part of the cultural fabric, shaping how people interpreted events, conversations, and even their own experiences. Crockett said that reversing this trend required more than fact-checking or corrective statements. It required rebuilding trust on a foundational level. People needed to believe that the government cared about them, that their voices mattered, that justice was a universal principle rather than a conditional privilege. The interviewer asked how she maintained her resolve in the face of such daunting obstacles. Crockett said that her resolve came from people, not politics. It came from constituents who had faced adversity and continued to fight for change. It came from survivors who refused to be silenced. It came from advocates who spent years pushing for reforms even when progress seemed out of reach. Their resilience fueled hers. And whenever she questioned whether her efforts made a difference, she reminded herself that change often began with discomfort, shifting conversations, challenging assumptions, refusing to accept distorted narratives as inevitable. She concluded this portion of the interview by saying that the path forward required collective courage. It required lawmakers willing to confront the truth even when the truth was unpopular. It required citizens willing to question narratives that elevated the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And it required a renewed commitment to the idea that justice was not a political weapon but a moral obligation. Crockett believed that if enough people embraced these principles, the country could begin to reclaim the integrity of its democratic institutions. The work would be difficult. The resistance would be fierce. But the alternative, allowing victimhood narratives to overshadow actual victims, was unacceptable.